College Football Nerds here talking a quick one with my main man, Josh. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. We're talking Ohio State and Missouri. And this is an interesting one because we don't know who's playing in this game, but we're just going to talk to y'all about it because it's Ohio State versus SEC. And when that happens, it always merits discussion. So we're going to get into this. Josh, one of the things that we were talking about as a pretty interesting storyline about this game is you have some opt-outs that are obvious, some opt-outs that haven't been announced yet. I don't think anybody believes Marvin Harrison's going to play in this game. We don't have good opt-out trackers, but we know a couple of players on each side we know that aren't going to play. And it might be that a lot of these players do play that people might think would opt out because they're riding the fence and have the opportunity against a brand name or against an SEC, offense on the other side to play their way into a better draft position, which is a really good reason to play this game and not opt out.
Yeah, this is especially true, I think, on the Missouri side. Luther Burden, Brady Cook, even to a certain extent Cody Schrader are guys that have had some hype off and on, but have flown largely under the radar. And I think they would get consideration for an upper level draft pick, maybe even top 3 rounds of the draft kind of guys. They could benefit a lot from big performances in these games. I think Luther Burden and Brady Cook in particular, if they were to really show up against Ohio State, would draw a lot of eyeballs to them and their performance. I've actually talked a lot in this year when we've done sort of non-structured things that Brady Cook was probably the best quarterback that nobody knew of for much of the year. Didn't necessarily in the year tops of our rankings, but in a lot of games he was really good. Now, people did figure out really in the LSU game he had some weird struggles with zone coverage. I think Ohio State is going to use that against him. We'll see if he continues there. It was almost like Jekyll and Hyde at times. I felt like him versus man versus compared to him versus zone. Something about his processing gets thrown for a whack. But he was really, really good. Schrader was extremely effective. I think people know him more, but like Luther Burden, Theo Weiss, guys like that have been very good for them throughout the year. I think there's also the same is true on the Ohio State side. A little harder because I think the notoriety is there, right? People know who Henderson is. They know who Harrison is. They know who Stover is. They know who Ibuka is. But guys like Ibuka, who was banged up through the year, probably couldn't have a statement game. If Harrison doesn't play, you could be the number 1 wide receiver. It could be a big deal for you. So I do think there are guys that may play in this game despite, especially like all the backup running backs for Ohio State, we know at this point are probably not going to play as transfers. But I think we may see more play than not. We're going to kind of have to hedge, I'm sorry guys, and not necessarily talk about opt-outs because outside, the obvious ones like Kyle McCord, we know Hopper's not playing. We know now Rakestraw's not playing for Missouri. Right now, very few of the rest that are notable names we'd want to mention are confirmed. So we're just kind of have to make a vague assumption of what each team's going to be and talk generally about what these teams are going into the game and why, and this is where I'm going to turn it back to you, Daniel, why I think it's pretty fascinating that this opened to only a 6.5 point spread, and now it's currently down to a 1 point spread in Ohio State's favor.
It also means that the viewers at home should take the model with a massive grain of salt. To me, I think this is an opportunity for really Ohio State's defense, and this is why a guy like Burke, I think, should play, even though he's a potential first-round draft pick. I want him to play his way into a first-round draft pick because I had a lot of arguments with people on Twitter, which is I never do, but I had arguments with him.
No, never Daniel. Daniel is never the one arguing with people on Twitter. Never him.
So when he had some struggles as a freshman and then a little bit the next year, I said he's a first-round corner. And so I need him to be a first-round corner so I can, put that thumb in everybody's eye and let them know I was right. I think that
nobody wants to be wrong on the internet.
I don't want people to be wrong on the internet. That's why I'm there to correct them. They're not fights. It's just a nice correction. Ohio State's defense has gotten a lot of love this year for being what I think is a very good defense, maybe an elite defense. The numbers say they're an elite defense. The problem is, and we talked about this in the Michigan-Alabama preview, Big Ten offenses have sucked this year. Outside of really Michigan, and to a lesser extent Maryland, a lot of the Big Ten offenses that Ohio State could have faced in any scenario were not very good. And then Notre Dame's offense, I think, was good enough to show that Ohio State isn't just a function of who they played. But I think it's an opportunity to play a good, not great, but very good SEC offense and show and flex a little bit and say, this is a building block for next year because we've got defense settled. This has been a question mark on Ryan Day for a long time. I would love, if I'm an Ohio State fan, to go into next year saying, okay, we're not taking a lot from the game, win or loss, but we're going to take away from this game that our defense is legit. If they can shut down Missouri and Missouri doesn't have a bunch of opt-outs, I think it's a very validating thing for Ohio State's defense this year of being not just a product of who they play, but an actual good defense. The flip side of this is the same thing for Missouri's offense as an opportunity to show that they're legit. And for those individual pieces, more so than overall, those individual pieces to play their way into a good draft pick. Josh, I think you should go ahead and get into the model because at least it can give us a primer on what the data sees these teams when healthy and when present overall for this year.
It's interesting you say that the model should be taken with a grain of salt because the original model number, 30.6 for Ohio State, 23.6 for Missouri, is a 7-point spread, which is almost exactly what the point spread was for this game. The over-under was 49. This number's a little higher, but it'd still be 54. So the model originally came out really close to the opening line for this bowl game. Something I always note is it's not that they have that line and then there's opt-outs and they move it. Vegas is taking bets at the opening line. Hopefully it doesn't get demonetized to say that. But the point I want to make is that line is set with some expectation of what the opt-outs are going to be, right? They're not just going to give you free money because they let you load up on one team knowing the other team is the one that's going to have all the opt-outs, right? They're going to try to take that into account. But even with that in mind, the model actually had this really close to the opening line to start with, which I think is really, truly kind of fascinating. Yards per play, Ohio State has an edge, 6.5 to 5.1. 8.8 yards per attempt, 4.1 yards per carry for Ohio State. Those are all good numbers. Missouri's pretty ugly, 6.7 yards per attempt, 3.5 yards per carry. I think the bigger difference there is it really reflects the fact that Missouri throws more than Ohio State does. And we talk about this a lot, right? You can have worse numbers, but generally you throw for more yardage than you run. And so if you're a pass-based team, you can have more offense with kind of worse passing and rushing stats because you just skew more towards pass, which is more effective. Ohio State has been much more run-heavy relatively. It's also interesting to note consistency scores. We talked in the playoff teams how they were all really low. These are really high, 85, 87. This is an example of teams our model feels like it kind of knows who they are, too. The scores that what it does is it goes back and looks at all the games they actually did play, and it remodels all those games, and then we generate this internal score to say, hey, how close was the modeling system, the scoring projection, the way that it generates scores with how things had actually happened, right? Or are the games just kind of all over the place? Because we have one model and you have a whole wide range of results. So maybe the results are consistent, maybe they're not consistent. In this case, they were. And so I do think that's all kind of fascinating. The other thing I'll note, Ohio State offensively, 4th in the country in passing yards, actually in passing yard per attempt when you adjust for it, which is kind of shocking given the thoughts I think certain people have about their starting quarterback. 1st in the country, though, in pass defense, 25th in pass rush defense. Missouri, though, is no slouch. 16th in our metrics in passing offense, 47th running. Kind of interesting. I think a lot of people talk about Schrader, but it's definitely the passing game that's driven Missouri more than the run game. Some teams have given up the run, I think partly because they so fear the pass. And defensively, 23rd, 40th. Nothing to write home about, but they're good. The flag that we made in this, and I'll say the shorthand version here, much longer discussion, one on Twitter at CFB Nerds. Like and subscribe our videos, and you'll see things like the Michigan, Alabama preview where we talk about this a lot more. If you like our content, always please subscribe. It helps us out a ton. The number of long passing plays between the two conferences is really disparate. Ohio State led the Big Ten with 22 passing plays of 30 yards or more. In the SEC, that would actually be tied with Texas A&M for 6th. Missouri is fourth with 26 plays of 30 yards per more. They have actually been a more explosive passing team than Ohio State. And so a big thing that you kind of have to keep in mind, and even our metrics can't fully adjust for it, is that the Big Ten's pass defense stats are probably skewed a little to the positive. That doesn't show up in our defensive rankings when we say 1 through 133 in terms of pass defense. It does show up in the model. We have a whole algorithm. I think, Daniel, when we wrote it, I think that algorithm was as long as the model itself to try to come up with some sort of adjustment for scoring. We can never do a very good job in these conference comparisons because of isolation, but to try to adjust for it. But I think it probably is showing up here in the scoring model and in the yardage model that being a good pass defense in the SEC is frankly just a lot harder than it is in the Big Ten. And that leads me to my last point on this. I'm fascinated by this game because I actually think it's kind of a canary in the coal mine. I think Ohio State is going to have some issues because the offense is gutted. And that probably is why the spread is low. And if they lose, I'm going to understand that's why they lose. This is why overall win-loss records in bowl games now are pretty... They've always been pointless because sometimes you have the number 1 versus the number 3, depending on who makes the championship, et cetera, et cetera. But here with opt-outs, it's totally pointless. But in particular here, how Missouri's offense does versus Ohio State's defense, which I imagine will be at least significantly intact, will be really telling on that disparity in passing offenses between the two conferences. Was it due to top-end defenses in the Big Ten, or was it due to a lack of competent, long, vertical passing offenses? Because there weren't, frankly, I don't think there were any Big Ten teams that had a good quarterback, good tackle play to block for downfield passes, and the receiving core to match. Ohio State's receivers are phenomenal. The quarterback play was, in my opinion, mediocre. I do believe, having gone back and watched it, I was even struck just how much, frankly, I think Kyle McCord cost them the Michigan game. But on top of that, the offensive tackles couldn't block enough to be vertical. So even when they wanted to be, even with what McCord did, he was asked to be a 10 to 20 yard passer. He was not asked to be a 30-plus yard passer. It really wasn't even about McCord. It was about time. And so is that about how good the defenses were to not let them throw downfield, how good the pass rushes were, or was it a personnel deficiency? So I'm fascinated about this game, which comes, a little early in December 29th, because I think it's really going to be a clue as to how a whole bunch of other games, Ole Miss, Penn State, Auburn, Maryland, Michigan, Alabama, how these games are going to go. I won't call it a litmus test, but it's a fascinating data point for me between the two conferences.
I do think it's also an opportunity to, even with opt-outs, Ole Miss, Penn State, Missouri, and Ohio State are opportunities to debunk what I think is a fairly casual narrative from non-SEC conferences where they're like, Missouri's overrated. And they say that because it's a brand name they don't respect, and it's part of this intrinsic need to say that the SEC is top-heavy because if the SEC is top-heavy, they're just like everybody else. I think the SEC fans who are saying Penn State is overrated and didn't earn their ranking are just as wrong as the people that are saying Missouri is overrated and they didn't earn their ranking. What I always say is, if they're overrated, let's look at who's rated just behind them and make an argument for them. Because it's easy to say someone in isolation is overrated. It's easy to say, oh, Missouri's overrated. Okay, if they're overrated, who behind them should be ahead of them and why? And that's where I think some of these things fall a little short. So I agree with you that, let's say Ohio State loses this game. I don't take away from that, SEC beat Ohio State. Like, I don't take that at all because they're going to be gutted, at least on offense. I do think that if Missouri, let's say they put up 30 points in this game, I do think that is an opportunity to glean some context from this season as it relates to offenses in respective conferences. However, I do not think that's going to happen. I think Ohio State's going to win. I know we said this is a short one. We didn't get into a lot of the personnel. I think Ohio State's going to run Brown a lot. I think they're going to get a lot of production on the ground from their quarterback. And it's something that we haven't seen from Ohio State this year because McCord didn't run. Give me Ohio State 24 and Missouri 20. And I think if Ohio State holds Missouri to 24 points or less, that is validating in their having a really solid, excellent defense. If Missouri starts putting up 350, throwing the ball, or they can run it well, then I'm going to have some questions. But for now, I don't think they do. And that's not a slight to Missouri. I think Missouri is an excellent football team, deserving of their ranking. I just think Ohio State's a little bit better. 24-20, tell me what you got.
I'm actually going to take Missouri in this one, 27-24. And again, it's a guess. The opt-out situation, when you start losing a large percentage of your starters on a given side of the ball, it's not just losing quality level. At some point, you lose cohesion, right? You lose your ability to execute. You tip balls, you drop balls, special teams goes to crap because there are different players playing. I think Missouri is going to be a little more cohesive. I think they're going to move the ball well enough. And I think, frankly, Ohio State I think their secondary in the back end is very good, but I think they're pretty untested. And what we tend to see in games like this where you get a team that hasn't really faced a passing offense of a certain level, sometimes they're a little shell-shocked. They give up plays they wouldn't normally give up. They wouldn't do in a rematch. And I think that may happen to Ohio State to a lesser extent, and they give up some points. I also think the offense is going to be so discombobulated that it's going to give up free points to a Missouri team that I think overall, over the course of the year, was greatly inferior, right? I mean, they ignore the ranking. I think everybody understands. Well, one, I'll say Ohio State, in my opinion, probably ended up being ranked too low over the course of the year. But two, like in our power ranking, Ohio State is third, Missouri's 14th. A lot of what Missouri is at is due to a somewhat accomplishment schedule, that kind of stuff. Missouri beating Kansas State was actually a decently big deal, and the greater span of out-of-conference data points. There weren't many good games that actually got played this year, and so that was fairly significant. But I think they do play over their head a little bit. I'm going to pick them to win, knowing the situation. But I don't know, and I'm actually fascinated about this game. It's one of the games I'm most looking forward to watching, which is why, not just because it's an Ohio State game, it's one of the reasons we're doing this preview. I don't know. It'll be fascinating to watch, and something I don't really know that I have a good feel for how it's going to turn out.
What does the score need to look like for you to feel like it is kind of a referendum game on that Ohio State defense, or the lack of good offenses in the Big Ten?
Ohio State's offensive output almost doesn't matter to me in terms of this, because Missouri's defense, let's be clear, was not great. They did get punked on pretty hard a number of times. LSU in that Missouri game, Missouri nearly won, but it was 39-49. They gave up 49 points to LSU. 30 points to Georgia in a game where Georgia didn't play well. Gave up 31 to Florida. They've struggled at times, and they've had some good ones like Tennessee. But Tennessee, sometimes Joe Milton doesn't know who his own team is. I think if Missouri scores north of 30 points, that's gonna really raise an eyebrow for me. Like if they're at 30, anything over 30, but especially if they get like 35 plus, even if it's a competitive game, even if they lose, that's going to raise a serious eyebrow to me. And it doesn't necessarily mean to me that the Big Ten isn't talented. What that's going to really tell me is the Big Ten defenses probably hadn't really seen anything like that before. And Missouri is not the best passing offense in the SEC, but they are one of the better ones. They're tied for fourth with Georgia. And I think to me, it's a little bit of a referendum on where the overall level of play was, that this never happened once to Ohio State in the regular season. And it's also, to me, again, a canary in the coal mine for all the Big Ten SEC matchups to come, that, hey, maybe there's something going on here that's gonna cause some real issues for the Big Ten.
All right, y'all. Let us know what you think about this game in the comments, and whether or not you think if Missouri puts up a number, assuming we give it context, assuming it's not because of a bunch of pick sixes and short fields, if it's a referendum on offenses writ large in the Big Ten. Let us know about that. Have a great holiday season. Thanks so much, y'all. God bless.